We're in the midst of a springtime of hope for America.
You ain't seen nothing yet.
Impulses of an evil empire.
Tear down this wall.
I believe that together we can keep this rendezvous with destiny.
In the next several minutes, you will learn things about President Ronald Reagan that you've never seen, heard, or read before. Welcome to today's special Newsmax event celebrating the life and legacy of President Reagan. During this historic presentation, we will commemorate President Reagan's storied life. We'll revisit his 2 terms in office and recollect his proudest achievements and greatest challenges. We'll also hear some candid interviews and private anecdotes from Reagan's inner circle, his closest friends, political confidants, and even some of his former adversaries. Ronald Reagan's life reads like a fairy tale of success stories. He was an accomplished athlete, an honored veteran, a famous actor, the governor of California, and of course, our nation's 40th president.
He called himself a citizen politician and only entered politics when he warned government was gaining too much power. By then he was age 54, with a successful career behind him. Twice elected President of the United States, Ronald Wilson Reagan was a contradiction to some. Once a Democrat, then a Republican. A champion of smaller government whose own government grew. A fiscal conservative who failed to balance the budget. His critics mistook his affability for weakness, but behind the smile and the charm existed an extraordinary leader with unique skills and bold and revolutionary ideas.
The short clip we just enjoyed comes from the critically acclaimed documentary Ronald Reagan, Rendezvous with Destiny. This groundbreaking film is hosted by former House Speaker and presidential candidate Newt Gingrich and his wife Callista. This special film includes never-before-seen interviews, rare archival footage, and dozens of fascinating facts about Ronald Reagan's life. For example, you'll find out why President Reagan went from being a Democrat to a Republican.
Over the next 8 years, Reagan honed his speeches and began to focus on the incompetence of big government. Reagan, a longtime Democrat and admirer of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, found his politics were changing too.
Well, he was a patriot beyond anything else. You know, he was a Franklin Delano Roosevelt Democrat, Harry Truman Democrat. But he says, as we all remember, he didn't leave the Democratic Party left him.
Ronald Reagan thought the Democratic Party left him because the Democratic Party changed some after FDR left. One, they didn't have the great charismatic leader, and Reagan certainly appreciated that. But which was the party that became the one of smaller government and lower taxes and really more aggressive in fighting communism? That was the Republican Party, and so he was drawn into it.
We are all so proud to be able to share with you these scenes from Ronald Reagan, Rendezvous with Destiny. Now, obviously, we can't show you the entire 90-minute documentary, just a few clips here and there, but that's okay, because in just a few minutes, we'll show you how you can get this phenomenal, award-winning film in its entirety, a $19.95 value for absolutely free. We're also going to show you the top moments that defined Reagan's presidency. Did you know that his famous line, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall," almost didn't make it in his speech? We'll tell you why. That's all coming up, but first, believe it or not, during his 8 years in office, President Reagan faced many of the same problems we're facing today. It was a time filled with turmoil and uncertainty. The American people were dispirited, and the economy was sputtering. So what did the president do to pull the country out of the financial gutter? Take a look.
Just a year into his presidency, Reagan faced a recession, the worst economic slowdown since the Great Depression.
I never will forget, the president's approval rating went down to 38%. And the White House was a bleak and a tad dreary place at that time. I know the president was concerned about it, but he was never totally dispirited. He never gave up.
He understood what made American capitalism work. He understood that individuals making their own private decisions about how to control their own lives was what makes the free market work. And he understood that the free market was far better than government bureaucracy in controlling the economy.
In 1983, after 16 months of recession, Americans went back to work. President Reagan's tax cuts, combined with deregulation, created 7 years of unprecedented economic growth.
Lower taxes generated economic growth. People used to poo-poo that, including some of us, I might add, who ran against him for other candidates. I ran George Bush's primary campaign against him in 1980. We called it voodoo economics. Well, I tell people I'm a reform drunk when it comes to Reaganomics because I ended up being President Reagan's Treasury Secretary.
Reagan understood there's a profound difference between tax rates and tax revenues. The lower rate led to more economic activity. The bigger the economy grew, the more the revenue base grew. And the highest testimony to Reaganomics was that it is now in place in Eastern Europe and many parts of the world, from Asia to, in some cases, Latin America and Africa.
The question remains, could the decisions President Reagan made yesterday provide the answers we're so desperately searching for today? You be the judge when you watch Ronald Reagan Rendezvous with Destiny. There's so much we can learn from President Reagan's message, and that is why, as I mentioned earlier, we want to send you this DVD valued at $19.95 right now in this free offer. That's how strongly Newsmax believes this film belongs in your home video library. We'll discuss how to get the DVD in this free offer, plus another exciting gift in just a moment. We'll also tell you how President Reagan practically ended the Cold War by simply taking off his jacket. Again, that's all coming up momentarily. But first, I'd like to bring in the host of Ronald Reagan Rendezvous with Destiny, former House Speaker and presidential candidate Newt Gingrich. Mr. Speaker, thank you for joining us. So what was it like working on this project? And can you tell us some of your favorite recollections of Ronald Reagan?
Well, Callista and I found it a very moving experience, partly because we went to the ranch. And we saw where Nancy and Ronnie Reagan had spent so much of their life. They spent 1 year out of the 8 years of the presidency at the ranch. If you accumulate all the time they spent there, he signed the famous 1981 Tax Cut Act, which relaunched the economy at a table at the ranch. And you could see when you were there, it's a very small ranch house. It's a very 1950s kind of decor. You could see how down home and how comfortable they were. How much they enjoyed being alone and how different it was from the public persona. So that was very touching. You could also see how long he'd been involved in the military. I didn't realize till I was at the ranch house, and I saw a picture on the wall of Ronald Reagan in a 1936 or 37 cavalry uniform on a horse. That he had been in the Army Reserves in the cavalry during the 1930s. I saw a copy of the 1939 Infantry at War, which is the basic manual issued at Fort Benning in 1939, sitting on the bookshelf that he clearly had read himself. All the way back then, preparing and thinking about national security. He served in World War II, and you really got a much deeper sense of the depth of their commitment to the country and the depth of their commitment to each other when you were when you went out to the ranch. We also were very fortunate. We filmed at Normandy, where President Reagan made one of his most powerful speeches in 1984 on the 40th anniversary of D-Day. And standing there at Pointe du Hoc, where the Rangers had climbed the cliffs, where Reagan made his speech, it was a very emotional feeling. And if you see the speech he gave that day, even today, I've seen the film probably 20 times, I still get tears every time you see the film. You see that one speech, because the daughter of one of the Rangers is there, and she has brought a letter that she had written her father that Reagan reads as part of this speech. And it is so memorable and so emotionally powerful about patriotism and service and duty that it really is a touching thing. The other thing is, he had enormous courage. People don't think of it this way, but he believed it was possible to defeat the Soviet Empire. Nobody in the elites believed that was possible. He didn't care. He believed in his heart he was right. He was prepared to risk his role in history doing it. He did succeed. It's an extraordinary achievement. He believed in free enterprise. He believed in the work ethic. He believed in encouraging everyday people to go out and do extraordinary things. And he knew that to the elites that looked like it was romantic and impractical. He didn't care. He knew what he believed. And when you see towards the end of the film his farewell address from the Oval Office, And he said, people said I gave great speeches. He said, I really gave speeches about great ideas. His ability to always, in a humble way, see himself as a part of the stream of history, not as the heroic central figure, was in fact one of the things that made him heroic.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you.
Obviously, the former speaker has very fond recollections of President Reagan. Let's check out another engaging scene from Rendezvous with Destiny and hear how the president is remembered by some of the folks in his inner circle.
Well, you know, it was easy to underestimate Mr. Reagan. For those of us who hadn't covered him regularly in California, when he first came to Washington, we weren't quite certain what to make of him. I remember once, just before he was sworn in, he was staying at Blair House across the street from the White House, and he was going to a function, some reception in a nearby hotel, and he walked down toward his limousine. And reporters were there, and we said, what about so-and-so and such and such? Well, he said, I don't know about that. And I said, perhaps with a trace of sarcasm in my voice, well, Governor, you ought to get them to tell you what's going on. And the late Mike Deaver says he almost tried to get out of the car to come back at me. But at the reception, he sought me out. He said, Sam, I tell them, they don't tell me. And I thought to myself, there's something here. This guy better be taken seriously. At least let's take a look at him.
Reagan got into politics because of what he believed. He was first a speaker and an ideological activist before he ran for elective office. So Reagan was a conservative first and a Republican second. He challenged the Republican establishment. He was a very unusual politician.
But, you know, here's one of the great things about Ronald Reagan, and there are very few political figures that I've ever met who could do this, and that was shut out the buzz in Washington. He'd be attacking the editorial pages and on television and by Democrats and even by some Republicans, and his aides at the White House would all be in a tizzy and everything. Didn't bother Reagan at all. He could just shut that stuff out, and it's a rare ability.
The secret to Governor Reagan and President Reagan's political successes is that he was always underestimated. People saw him as a grade B movie actor, and he always exceeded expectations, and that's what politics is all about.
I think President Reagan was at heart a very humble man. He is somebody who did not take credit for things. In fact, one of my favorite Reagan sayings, there's no end to what you can accomplish if you're willing to give credit to others. And that's the point. As long as you're not obsessed with who gets credit, you can accomplish a great deal. And I think that was what defined President Reagan.
Certainly, many factors define President Reagan. In fact, we'll be exploring some of the most defining moments of his presidency. That's all coming up. But right now, I want to tell you about the exciting gift I alluded to earlier. In addition to the free DVD copy of Ronald Reagan Rendezvous with Destiny, Newsmax would also like to present to you, free of charge, this beautiful collector's limited edition of our special issue commemorating the 100th anniversary of President Reagan's birth, valued at $5. The issue is stuffed with interesting factoids and tidbits about President Reagan's life before, during, and after his presidency. It also includes a conversation with presidential historian Douglas Brinkley, the best-selling author of the Reagan Diaries. He tells us what President Reagan would say to the American people if he were alive today. The special issue also includes an exclusive personal account written by former Reagan adversary, Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev. He reveals what he really thought of President Reagan when they first met in Geneva in 1985. You won't believe the one word he called Reagan. And here's a real treat. In this Reagan Centennial Special Edition, you will take a private tour of President Reagan's ranch, and his son Michael is your guide. Now, we all know that Ronald Reagan loved jelly beans, but did you know that he had a passion for peanut butter? Michael will tell us what he did with all of his empty peanut butter jars. I wonder if Nancy approved. It is truly a spectacular issue, cover to cover. And speaking of the cover, a lot of people mistake this image of Ronald Reagan for a photograph. It's not. It's a painting. The artist Ross R. Rawson invited Newsmax to his studio in Atlanta to share his experiences creating this magnificent portrait of our 40th president. You'll get to read all about that as well. Newsmax, of course, is the nation's leading publication for current events, politics, finance, and health, and covers the stories the mainstream media won't touch. So I'd like to bring in one of the architects of this historic Ronald Reagan publication, senior editor David Patton. David joins us from the Newsmax newsroom. Hello, David. Thank you for being here.
Well, thanks for having me.
David, I know your experiences working on this issue in particular were incredibly rewarding, but what is it about this Reagan Centennial commemorative issue that's made it one of Newsmax's most popular issues to date?
Well, I think there were three things, basically. I mean, first of all, you have to begin with the man himself, Ronald Reagan, considered by some to be the most important president of the modern political era, and by conservatives to perhaps be the most important president of the 20th century. So any biographer of Ronald Reagan is going to have a wealth of material to work with, and from there you just try to pick the stories that do the best job of portraying who Ronald Reagan really was. The second thing that was a big factor was the editorial approach that Newsmax took to the story. Rather than try to put an editorial filter in between the reader and Ronald Reagan, we spared no expense going out to interview people who knew Ronald Reagan, family members, worked with him, historians who had just pored over all of his writings. And by doing that, we were able to kind of take ourselves out of the equation and really have Ronald Reagan sort of walk into your living room and introduce himself and have a conversation with you around the coffee table. That was the goal. And then the third factor is the dream team, really, of contributors that we were able to sign on board to help us with this project. I'm talking about people like former Florida Governor Jeb Bush, former Speaker of the House and now GOP presidential candidate Newt Gingrich, Sarah Palin, Haley Barbour, Michael Reagan himself, just on and on and on. An amazing roster of contributors who told in their own personal terms what Ronald Reagan meant to them.
You mentioned historians, and presidential historian Douglas Brinkley, who spent countless hours dissecting the Reagan Diaries and later authored a best-selling book by the same name. He wrote a riveting special report called The Transformational President for this issue, and that's quite a coup, isn't it?
You couldn't really even hope for someone better suited and better qualified to write a magazine cover story, commemorative edition cover story of Ronald Reagan than Douglas Brinkley. I mean, after all, he's a noted historian, best-selling author, teaches history at Rice, but also he was able to get his hands on the actual Reagan diaries. You know, a lot of people don't know that Ronald Reagan, although the media tried to give him this reputation as sort of a lightweight, intellectual, second-rate actor, the truth is that Ronald Reagan wrote most of his own speeches, and he kept a diary. He wrote in a diary every single day. He was actually a formidable intellectual figure, as you would expect from somebody of his notable accomplishments. And Brinkley's able to bring all of that out in the article, and it really makes it a terrific read.
Well, very interesting. Newsmax's editor and CEO Christopher Ruddy recently traveled to Moscow to interview the former Soviet Premier Mikhail Gorbachev, who wrote a very complimentary article entitled Reagan and Me. How did that come about?
Well, it took a lot of negotiations and behind-the-scenes work, as you might imagine. Newsmax has some very high-level political contacts who sort of helped us to approach the Gorbachev camp and arrange this very special interview with Gorbachev. It took place at the Gorbachev Foundation in Moscow and really was a fascinating point of view, really from the other side of the Iron Curtain, if you will, on Ronald Reagan. One of the fascinating things about it is that Gorbachev actually recognized the greatness of Ronald Reagan. You know, in their first meeting, Ronald Reagan told Gorbachev that he was an old communist Bolshevik. And Gorbachev shot back, well, you are a dinosaur. He said that to Ronald Reagan. And yet, out of that unique historic relationship, the two men were able to build a bond and to manage this process of ending the Cold War. A truly extraordinary historical accomplishment, and we get to hear about it from Gorbachev's point of view. Gorbachev said of Reagan, he was a great man. And there's no question in reading that interview that he genuinely considered Ronald Reagan to be the lead actor in that performance.
Something else that people will see in this edition is that Michael Reagan takes readers on an intimate tour of his father's favorite place, which was Rancho de Cielo, his ranch in Santa Barbara. Talk a little bit about that.
I think that's my favorite part of the entire cover story. It was just amazing. The Young America's Foundation, which manages the Reagan Ranch, gave us behind-the-scenes access to every area of the ranch. And to have Michael Reagan, Ronald Reagan's son, take us on a tour, you just got to see things in this beautiful 6-page pictorial spread of photographs of the Reagan Ranch that you would never otherwise see. For example, you get to see the actual tack room where Ronald Reagan's saddle is hung up just the way that it was the day that he left the ranch. He'd take the saddle, heft it over a horse, and go out for his daily ride. You also get to see his workbench. He had actually a very elaborate workbench, every tool in its proper place. I don't usually think of Ronald Reagan as being particularly a handy fellow, mechanically minded, but apparently he was, and he was also very careful about how he kept everything in the Reagan Ranch. Another great thing you get to see is a formation, a landmark, if you will, on the Reagan Ranch called Heart Rock. And there, Michael Reagan, Ronald Reagan, and really 3 generations of the Reagan family have signed their initials. They've put their initials in that rock there. And so it sort of commemorates the entire family. Michael Reagan shows us that personally. And just as Ronald Reagan wrote his initials in that rock, he also wrote his name into the history books, of course. And we're reminded of one thing that he said in one of his last speeches. He said, "We set out to change a nation, and we ended up changing the world."
Definitely a lot of people, I think, are really going to enjoy reading this.
We
David
hope so.
Padden, Newsmax senior editor, thank you for joining us today to tell us about this wonderful issue honoring President Ronald Reagan.
Thank you.
Okay, let's turn our attention back to the DVD documentary and to the top defining moments of Ronald Reagan's political career. Let's go back to 1976. President Ford just defeated Reagan for the GOP nomination. And what happened next opened the door for Reagan's landslide victory just 4 years later.
In 1976, Ronald Reagan's bid for the Republican nomination went all the way to the convention in Kansas City, Missouri. But incumbent President Gerald Ford defeated Reagan by a narrow margin on the first ballot. Reagan, already 65 years old, would have to wait another 4 years until 1980 to try again.
Then, an extraordinary moment occurred. Ford, responding to the convention crowd, invited Reagan on stage.
I would be honored on your behalf to ask my good friend, Governor Reagan, to say a few words at this time.
What Reagan did in that moment, no one has ever done anything like that. He doesn't give a normal concession speech or really any kind of concession speech at all. He talks about nuclear weapons. He's saying this is the menace to the world.
President,
he gives a speech that is a candidate speech for 1980.
This is our challenge, and this is why here in this hall tonight, better than we've ever done before, we've got to quit talking to each other and about each other and go out and communicate to the world that we may be fewer in numbers than we've ever been, but we carry the message they're waiting for. We must go forth from here united, determined that what a great general said a few years ago is true. There is no substitute for victory. Mr. President.
He declared his candidacy for the presidency in the moment in which the other guy had just been nominated.
And that was without a teleprompter. He certainly was the great communicator. Many of Reagan's most defining moments came at the expense of the Soviets. In fact, President Reagan's uttering of just 2 words changed forever the way the world viewed the Soviet Union.
So in your discussions of the nuclear freeze proposals, I urge you to beware the temptation of pride, the temptation of blithely declaring yourselves above it all, and label both sides equally at fault, to ignore the facts of history and the aggressive impulses of an evil empire.
Now, when he calls them an evil empire, that's going to get their attention. And it got their attention.
He could not have helped us better than by using this term. He defined our enemy in a very precise way. I don't think any missiles or any army would have been more effective than this.
Reagan's age was always a hot topic, especially with the late-night comedians. But in 1985, at the first U.S.-Soviet summit in years, Ronald Reagan did something that practically ended the Cold War and had him appearing far more virile than his much younger adversary. Take a look.
I'll never forget it, standing in the press pen in the cold in Geneva, outside, waiting for Gorbachev's big automobile to arrive. Reagan was inside.
And around the corner comes this long ZIL limousine. Out comes Gorbachev with a hat on, with a scarf on, with a coat on, and he just looks like a gnarled old man.
Ronald Reagan walked down the steps in this bone-chilling weather without an overcoat, and obviously without a hat.
Reagan looks like the future. He looks like, tomorrow.
So the pictures showed a vibrant, youthful, if you will, Ronald Reagan, and this older man who was actually much younger. I mean, you say, well, what does that matter? Oh, it matters a great deal from the standpoint of the way the world looks at leadership and the way the world looks at people.
Now, that's truly what one would call a fashion statement. President Reagan gave many memorable speeches, but perhaps his most defining was delivered at the Brandenburg Gate near the Berlin Wall in 1987. Who will ever forget him saying, "Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall"? More powerful words were never spoken, but the interesting thing is, they almost weren't.
Mr. Gorbachev, tear down this wall.
And there were several of us on the staff who thought maybe that wasn't a good line to leave in there because we just didn't believe the wall was going to come down anytime soon. President Reagan said, "That doesn't matter, I want to say it, and I'm going to say it." He was right. He was on the crest of history that day.
Can you imagine if someone had gone to that wall and faced the cameras and said, "Mr. Gorbachev, come open this gate. Mr. Gorbachev, please tear down this wall"? But when Reagan said it, everyone thrilled to it. Everyone understood that here was someone who not only had an idea, but he knew how to project it.
If President Reagan were with us here today, he'd probably tell us that his most defining moment came during the darkest hour of his presidency.
Mr. President!
Good evening. Ronald Reagan, 40th President of the United States, today became the 8th Chief Executive Officer of this country to be the target of an assassin.
Well, as a presidential scholar, the very thought of getting to look at a president's handwritten diaries is very exciting. You see early on, March of '81, he's shot, he's almost dead. And you can see him rummaging through his back pages of his life, and he's writing about what does my life all mean, and suddenly he says, "From now on, I'm going to dedicate my life to God."
President Reagan returned to the White House 12 days after being shot with a new sense of urgency. 2 weeks later, he received a hero's welcome from Congress.
You wouldn't want to talk me into an encore, would you? Mr. Speaker, Mr. President, distinguished members of the Congress, honored guests, and fellow citizens, I have no words to express my appreciation for that greeting.
We only had time to share just a few of the top defining moments in Ronald Reagan's presidency, but you'll get to see them all in Rendezvous with Destiny. By the way, the president's close relationship with the Pope is especially fascinating. You'll also learn how dealing with an alcoholic father helped shape Reagan's ability to negotiate. And if you ever wondered what the leader of the free world likes to get for the holidays, well, you'll find that out as well. So let's review today in this free offer. We are sending you a copy of Ronald Reagan, Rendezvous with Destiny, and the collector's limited edition of our issue commemorating the 100th anniversary of President Reagan's birth. We only have a limited number of these DVDs and an extremely limited number of commemorative issues. So once we're out, I'm sorry, we're out. So in other words, if you're planning to accept this free offer, please do so now rather than wait till tomorrow. Again, your DVD includes the 90-minute critically acclaimed documentary, Ronald Reagan, Rendezvous with Destiny. a behind-the-scenes special, a music featurette, and a special message from hosts Newt and Callista Gingrich. And your limited edition Ronald Reagan commemorative issue includes the Douglas Brinkley Special Report, The Transformational President, and the article Reagan and Me, written by Mikhail Gorbachev, the private tour of Reagan's ranch, a commentary from economist Ben Stein, and much, much more. If you're like the millions of patriotic Americans who loved Ronald Reagan, you owe it to yourself to get these incredible mementos celebrating our nation's 40th president. The Rendezvous with Destiny DVD and the Ronald Reagan Centennial issue. I'm sure you'll treasure these special gifts for years to come. On behalf of everyone here at Newsmax, thank you very much for watching. We'll see you next time.
You ain't seen nothing yet.
Impulses of an evil empire.
Tear down this wall.
I believe that together we can keep this rendezvous with destiny.